I'm Linda Calhoun, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Michelle Nunn is President and CEO of CARE USA, a leading humanitarian organization that fights global poverty and provides life-saving assistance in emergencies. Last year, CARE worked in 90 countries around the world and reached more than 72 million people. Previously, she co-founded the volunteer mobilization organization Hands On Atlanta, which later merged with President George H.W. Bush's volunteer promotion organization, Points of Light. She also served as their CEO. And if the name Nunn sounds very familiar to you, yes, Michelle is the daughter of the Honorable Sam Nunn, who was served as the distinguished senator from Georgia from 1972 to 96, where he spent several years as chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So for those of you who are here tonight, you can see the program flyer for Michelle's complete full biography, but please join me now in welcoming Michelle Nunn for a conversation about how the struggle for women's empowerment in Syrian refugee camps and how organizations like CARE can provide Syrian refugees with the resources to build a brighter future. Can you tell us a little bit about why you were drawn to lead this organization? Why did you want to take this on?
I have dedicated my career to public service. I have great role models in my family. You mentioned my father, who served in the Senate from 1972 to 1996, and so I had this exemplar of a family that wanted to make a difference, and I grew up wanting to do the same. I had the opportunity to do that through a variety of different vehicles, starting a small community-based volunteer organization that ultimately grew into a national and international volunteer organization. I actually, in 2014, ran for Senate, U.S. Senate in Georgia. Obviously, I was not successful because here I sit. I've had a lot of people who've told me that I can get a lot more done at CARE than I can in Washington these days, which I think may be very true. But the common thread is the capacity to make a difference. And I can't think of a mission that I more admire or I think is more powerful than CARE's mission in the world. And we're taking on what I think are the most important challenges in the world and focusing on women and girls to combat and overcome extreme poverty. And so the confluence of the mission and the fact that I get to be literally 2 miles from my house where the CARE headquarters is, which it happens to be this extraordinary organization with a 70-year history and a huge scale and platform that I'm so proud is located right in Georgia.
So it was predestined, really, in many ways. And so, you spoke a little bit about the mission of CARE. We know it's a humanitarian organization, but your work is in many different sectors, reaching around the world. Can you tell us a bit about how CARE started and how your mission has evolved over time?
So just this past spring, CARE celebrated its 70th anniversary, and it was an extraordinary thing because we assembled, among other ways of celebrating, some of the original recipients of CARE packages from 70 years ago. And so we got to hear the stories of what it meant to receive a CARE package if you were an 11-year-old little boy who was, in essence, a refugee after the war in Germany. And the remarkable difference that had made in their lives, and then looking at the arc of those 70 years and thinking about the changes that CARE itself has gone through. We over the first 20 years of our existence, we really shipped and delivered over 100 million CARE packages. But over the 70 years, we have evolved and changed ourselves. We're now operating in 90 different countries. We're really looking at what are the systemic roots of poverty and social injustice, and how do we get at those roots, and what do we do in order to really make a sustainable, scaled, long-term difference. And so we work in a variety of different arenas. Again, with the real focus on women and girls as a lever for change, and as partners in change. And then really looking at, for instance, food, nutrition, security. How are we going to ensure that people around the world have the capacity to feed themselves over the next 50 years? How do we ensure that women have full economic empowerment and have the capacity and access to education? And then also, how are we responding to humanitarian concerns? We are going to talk, I know,
Yes.
about one dimension of the enormity of the humanitarian crises that are facing us. And then we also work around sexual and reproductive health and gender-based violence. And so those are sort of the four major sort of areas where CARE is focused. And it all adds up to a tremendous amount of change. We are looking to affect and really change the lives of over 200 million people between now and 2020. And so we have some big ideas about how to do that. And really it will involve partners, it will involve advocacy, and it will involve innovation.
Great. And specifically, you mentioned several sectors. Can we talk about what you're doing in terms of the humanitarian work, the dealing with refugees?
Yes. So I guess today is Tuesday, right? So I've lost track of the week. Yesterday was World Refugee Global, this day in which we really commemorate and focus on the fact that we have so many refugees in the world, and in fact a historic threshold, 65 million. That was there was a lot of reflections about that yesterday.
And Michelle wrote a blog if you want to check out for the World Affairs, if you want to check out her statement on that.
So that really does create an unprecedented, I think, both responsibility and real, I think, imperative for the global community. And CARE is a part of the equation, part of the efforts that are addressing the needs of refugee families and around the world. We have a particular focus right now in a variety of different places, but one that's been in the news is in the Syrian situation and conflict. So we're working in Jordan and Lebanon and in Turkey, and doing a variety of different things. I mean, most people, I think, when they think about refugees, they're thinking about refugee camps. The majority of Syrian refugees are not living in camps, they're living in communities. And so we're working in both contexts, but the real challenges include everything from psychosocial support, which is part of what CARE is doing, to just economic access for refugees. One of the barriers that I think people don't realize is that in most of these situations, for instance in Turkey and in Jordan, it's very difficult to have the capacity to legally work. And so when you think about it, if you have lost everything, you've left your home, you've left your former livelihoods, and you're actually precluded from working from a legal perspective. So, where does that leave you in terms of your capacity to begin to rebuild your lives? There are the difficulties of just the pure, how do we ensure that the Syrian refugee children have the capacity for an education? So, as an example, CARE is providing vouchers to some of the children in Jordan, to the families, to enable them to send their children to school. I met with a family that had 4 little boys. We sat in a circle, and three of them were there. The 13-year-old, the mother explained, was working at a farm and was coming home once a month to be with his family for one day a month, and this was basically the provider of the family. The 11-year-old had also been working, but CARE's voucher was able to enable the family to support themselves and at the same time send their children to school. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing. We're also providing what we've been calling sort of the modern day care package, which is not something that we're delivering from the U.S., but which is literally a kind of a credit card that refugee families can use in local shops to provide the provision of their basic necessities, food, and they're able to choose themselves what it is that they need. and they're also able to support the local economy. So, so these are some of the challenges and opportunities. And we're also working, because you can imagine, if you think about where is it that that refugees are located, they're, by and large, although the focus has been on refugee acceptance in Europe or in America, majority of refugees are in developing countries and are in fragile states themselves. So a place like Jordan or a place like Lebanon, where 25% of the people now living in Lebanon are refugees. So imagine what that means in terms of the responsibility that they're bearing, and then think about what is it that the global community should be doing in order to support that, that responsibility that they're taking on.
Yeah, and just to bring our audiences more up to speed on what's happened in Syria, we're going into the 5th year of this crisis, and you're doing emergency humanitarian relief efforts. Can you just talk about the enormity of the crisis that Syrians are facing?
Yeah. So it is hard to get your arms around it. So over 4.5 million people that have fled Syria and that are seeking shelter, refuge, the capacity to rebuild their lives. 6.5 million people that are displaced within Syria. And then a total of 13 million people that are in need of humanitarian assistance in Syria. So a huge challenge, and really unprecedented since World War II. And I think it is easy sometimes to get lost in those numbers, right? Which is why, in some ways, I want to bring people to thinking about each one of those individual numbers that we talk about represents an individual story or a family, and they each have story of loss, of resiliency, of hope, of real opportunity before them, and so the challenge, I think, is how do we help people rebuild their lives, especially when every single one of the families that I spoke to living in Jordan and in Turkey said, first of all, what they most wanted was to go home. They want to, of course. I mean, they want to go to the place that they've known that is their place of their center. And then they also wanted to stay close to home, so they would prefer to be in Turkey or in Jordan. But if they're not given the opportunity and they have no capacity to earn a living, if they have no capacity to educate their children, to feel like they can build a future for their children, then you are faced with an impossible choice. And so again, I think that what we need to embrace is that we have to invest in order to ensure that, for instance, that we're addressing the systemic issues, first of all, in Syria around the global and political crisis, and that we're investing in the capacity to share the responsibility for helping people rebuild their lives so that they do not feel like they are forced to put their own lives in danger and cross waters and to risk their own lives in order to cross into Europe or other places. And I think we have to think about, from a U.S. perspective, how are we leading by example, and what is it that we're doing that would demonstrate that we have some moral capacity to speak about what we hope others will do in absorbing this global responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And let's dive a little deeper. I mean, what are some of the needs, the pressing needs that Syrian refugees are facing, and specifically the disproportionate impact that being a refugee has on women and girls? Can you speak to us about that?
So CARE just recently released a report that talked about the effect of humanitarian disaster or crisis or conflict on women and girls. And there was a statistic in there that said that women and then girls and boys are 14 times more likely to be in harm's way or to be really affected by crisis. And so it that makes sense, right? They're in some sense already potentially vulnerable, and if you put them into a conflict situation, they are the most vulnerable. So we do have to think proportionally around how are we safeguarding and supporting women and girls and boys in these situations. And that means everything from psychosocial support, very specifically one of the areas that CARE is offering, to basic provision of food, shelter, clothing, to the next level, which is sustainable livelihood provision. So how do we give them the capacity to earn money, to provide for themselves, and a pathway in which they can see their future? And how do we ensure that they have the capacity to educate their children? Which is at the root of a family's concern, of course. I mean, we all think about what do we want for our children, what do we want for our grandchildren. These are the same concerns that they have. And and that's just a starting point. And all of that starts, again, with safety and security, and then medical provision, right? If from a health concern, reproductive health is something that often gets neglected. You can imagine in a time of loss and again, dislocation from every form of security, medical support that you've known. As just one example. So those are some of the specific areas that we hear over and over again that people are looking for, and some of the ways that CARE is specifically supporting.
Great. And in terms of, actively responding to the Syrian crisis, again, just sort of walking us through what CARE is doing in terms of addressing those needs?
I should also talk about the fact that in Syria itself, you have an enormous set of needs and intervention, which in some ways is the most complicated to address because of the security issues. So, as an example, CARE, for instance, is not physically operating with our staff in Syria. We are partnered with local organizations that are providing services of basic support, everything from issues around water. I mean, just having pure water, and certainly the provision of food, as an example. In Syria. We're also working on basic livelihood issues. So how do we help people to support themselves from an agricultural perspective, to diversify their capacity to bring in food and to be able to be sustaining during a time of great fragility and conflict. And I think one thing that was important for me to understand and to really appreciate what is happening, for instance, in a situation like Syria is, it is not as if Syria had a huge number of locally based humanitarian organizations that are now performing the work that they've always done. I mean, the work that is happening in Syria is now, imagine any of us in this room deciding, many times intentionally, I will stay here in this place, my community, my country, a place of great danger, but where I will now actually work to support, through medical provision, through the provision of food, my countrymen and my sort of neighbors. And so these are people that have become humanitarian workers who were not humanitarian workers 5 years ago, who were engineers or who were teachers or who were lawyers or who were doctors. And so I am incredibly inspired to think about the courage and resiliency of those people in Syria who themselves are responding in this extraordinary way. And CARE and other international NGOs are able to partner with them to support from a technical assistance perspective, to invest in those efforts, but recognizing that they are incredibly brave and courageous and demonstrating, I think, the best of both human nature and certainly the leadership and courage that it will take to continue to rebuild Syria. In terms of the refugee work that we're doing, I mentioned psychosocial support. We are literally offering counseling for people, and we provide people come to community centers in community and in camps, and they tell us this is what our family currently needs. It could be medical support, it could be psychosocial support, it could be food, it could be, and we are then helping get them the right kind of support. So that's one basic set of services. We also were providing, as I said, vouchers so that people, the most vulnerable families, have the capacity to provide food and clothing for their own families, and shelter, and be able to afford shelter. And then we also were doing some unique things. We are actually training Syrian refugees themselves as volunteer leaders, and they are providing peer counseling to their to their fellow refugees. And one of the remarkable things to me was to talk to some of these Syrian refugee volunteers who said that it's the first time that they have felt alive again in their capacity to actually be helping. So, you can imagine having lost everything, the capacity to then be of use and to feel like you are of service is perhaps the most humanizing thing that you can do for someone, is to give them that power back. And so we're working in those areas as well, as just a handful of the examples. I also talked about providing vouchers so that families can send their children to school and helping around the educational needs.
And so what is needed to help support the work that CARE is doing in terms of its humanitarian efforts? I mean, as you said, you're not doing the old-fashioned care packages anymore, so you don't have to provide meals ready to eat and that sort of thing. But what's needed? I mean, what do Syrian refugees need? And, maybe talk about some of the actors that you would like to see provide some of that assistance.
So I think in terms of the global community's threshold of expectation or aspiration around the investment that's required to meet the most basic needs, we're only at about half of that. And CARE itself is probably is about half of what we have set our goal around. So just from a pure resource perspective, there are resources that are needed to invest in the humanitarian response, both in Syria and refugees. Well, we've actually about $250 million for CARE is what we're looking at.
And you're at half that goal.
About half of that. So that's one thing. So we're constantly hoping that people will recognize the importance of investing and investing in these kinds of humanitarian disasters. I think we are particularly good when there is a natural disaster and it's on the news and we focus on it. People, and we are very generous, right? But it's hard for these protracted crises that go on for years and years and years. I think people lose their own sense of efficacy around giving, and we need to remind them that you can help and that it is making a difference for individual families and communities. So that's one thing. A second thing that people can do, and what's needed, is advocacy. People can lift up their voices, and we need people to lift up their voices and first of all say we need to make sure that we're investing effectively and appropriately in these humanitarian crises. So it happens that that Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan are proximate to Syria. But this is a global responsibility, and we need to support it as a global responsibility. So we need people who advocate and lift up their voices to ask our own government and the international community to invest effectively. We also need our political leaders to know that it matters to their constituents that we use our political will to try and find a political and diplomatic solution to the Syrian crisis, as an example, because that's what ultimately it will take in order to ensure that people do have the capacity to return to Syria and to stem the humanitarian tide. So those are some of the things that I think are required, both from us individually and also from us as a government, as a nation, and as a part of the global community.
Absolutely. You talked a little bit about being in Turkey and Jordan and meeting some of the refugee families there. Are there any more stories you can share with us that sort of give you hope and keep you going in terms of doing work that's very difficult?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned the family that I met, and thinking about, I think for all of us who have children in our lives in some way or another, thinking about, for instance, an 11 and 13-year-old working full-time to support a family and what that means. And when I asked the mother of these boys what it was that finally made her leave their home, right? Because it's a big, right, what is it that actually, what is the moment at which you say, I'm going to leave everything that I know, I'm going to leave my home, my livelihood, my connections, my community. And she pulled over her little 4-year-old boy, and she lifted up her shirt, and she showed me the shrapnel wound on his stomach. And so she said, and her words were, well, what choice did I have? And so thinking through, like, what does it bring when people are also crossing the ocean and they are risking their lives, and they know that thousands before them have died in that crossing? What is it that is leading them to make that choice? What is it that's leading them to give up almost everything in order to pursue their capacity to rebuild their lives? So that's both a note of despair, but also of resilience and hope, and the capacity for people to sort of go through the threshold of extraordinary challenge, and to continue to believe in and invest in their rebuilding their own lives, and especially living for their children. The mother of those little boys said that what she wanted more than anything was for her children to have a chance. And she also went on to say, like, her children, imagine, just like all of us, she said, my children never missed a single day of school in Syria. Wow. And so here they are missing years of school. But I met a woman named Nisreen, who introduced herself, literally came up to me and shook my hand and said, I lost everything beautiful in my life in the war. And then you think about, like, what it would mean to lose everything that you treasured and valued in your life. And those are the ordinary things, the things that we all take for granted. She talked about she was a teacher, coming home, cooking for her family, watching her son do his homework, and losing all sense of normalcy. But then the second thing she said to me was, but I have become an extraordinarily powerful woman. And she indeed was an extraordinarily powerful woman. She's now a teacher in the camps. She's working to support refugee children. She was a community advocate for care and becoming an ambassador to make sure that the needs of the refugee community were being heard and were represented. So I think it is both daunting to meet and hear about individual families and stories, and also I think a source of renewal and inspiration, and a real my hope is that by telling these stories, it reminds people that we have a connective solidarity with these individual families, and that we have to remember that they are individual families, and that we each have a capacity to make a difference in their lives.
And speaking of that solidarity, I mean, one of the things that just reminded me of the enormous generosity of the American public. There was refugees from Europe who got the original care packages that wrote letters to this current group of Syrian refugees. Can you tell us about that effort?
Yeah. Part of what we did around our 70th anniversary was to ask some of the original recipients of the care package to write letters to Syrian refugee children, so children that would have been about the same age as they were after World War II. And I think it was sort of an interesting idea, and it turned out to be a really inspired idea, because what we saw is the arc of change and possibility in people's lives. I think if you think about the refugee child that has become now a citizen of America, who has become a doctor and has gone on to live this life that might have seemed impossible to him when he was an 11-year-old that was dependent upon his care packages for his family. And for them to send hope and letters in which they say, don't give up, I know how you feel to live in a strange land, in a strange place, having lost everything, was really an extraordinary connection. And we did some videos of this exchange that had millions of viewers, because it was this really inspired, emotional connection, and to hear the Syrian refugee children talk about the fact that one of the young girls that received a letter said, when she's been asked, what is it that you most miss? What is it that you've lost the most? She said, I miss myself. I miss who I was. I've lost myself in this in this war. And she said when she got this letter of hope that she felt like it made her feel like she was recognized, that she had lost her own sense of self and identity, and all of a sudden recognizing that somebody else saw her was, bearing witness to what she had been through, and also giving her a sense of hope.
And we've been focusing pretty much on the Middle East in our discussion thus far tonight. Where are some of the other areas around the world where there are looming humanitarian crises that we should all be aware of?
Yeah. Well, I think we who are in the humanitarian aid world sort of lament that we can't draw attention sufficiently to any of these crises. So we feel like there's not enough attention, right, and not enough investment in a place like Syria. But what the kind of attention that Syria has received as compared to, for instance, Yemen. How many times have any of us seen Yemen on the front page of any newspaper? And yet 80% of the population there is in need of humanitarian assistance, 21 million people. And so drawing attention to some of these, what I would call almost invisible crises, there's an enormous drought, as many of you all know, in the Horn of Africa. I was in Ethiopia a few months ago, over 10 million people vulnerable, that's also true in Southern Africa. I just got back from a trip to Niger, which is an example, I think, of an area, again, not getting very much attention. But if we want to be more proactive and preemptive around how do we support people and countries before they become with the magnitude and scale of, for instance, Syria, I think we have to pay attention. And so in the week that I arrived to Niger, there's a region called Diffa, which is on the border of Nigeria. Militants crossed over from Nigeria and attacked. I think it's the 35th attack in the last year. There are 250,000 refugees now living in Diffa in Niger, not something that people are focused on. Mm-hmm. And in the week that I was there were an additional 75,000 people that were displaced. And so how are we investing there? Now, I talked about Syria being at a 50% mark. They're at a 25% mark in Diffa in terms of what the threshold is that they require. And we're fulfilling less than a quarter of that. So one of the challenges that I think organizations like CARE have is to really break through and to help walk people through the enormity of challenges and our capacity to make a difference around those challenges. So it's why evenings and gatherings like this one are so important, and why the World Affairs Council is also such an important vehicle for, again, how do you have these discussions and how do you bring people into the international community and the capacity to recognize their gifts and opportunities as global citizens.
And so let's be more specific in terms of what can people here in this audience and what can we do throughout the U.S. to help?
Yeah. Well, I talk to people over and over again about lifting up your voice, because it really does matter. CARE, as an example, is a part of a coalition that's been pushing on a piece of legislation called the Global Food Security Act, which, fingers crossed, in the next 2 weeks will pass. It has been in the works for over 10 years. Oh my God,
so we need to write our senators.
You need to write your senators and congressmen. It's mainly we need to focus on the House. Okay. To say that we want to do this. It is a piece of legislation that is budget neutral and that will feed hundreds of thousands of additional people just through efficacy, transparency, better public policy. And codifying some of the things that we already know about food aid reform. It focuses on women smallholder farmers as a way of ensuring that we're actually building sustainable and long-term capacity for people to grow and feed themselves with their own food. So that's an example of like, okay, when people start to worry, does my voice make a difference? It really does make a difference. That's one small piece of legislation, and we need people to lift up their voices. There's a whole range of advocacy efforts that we have that truly can and will make a difference if people will coalesce. So the people that are in this audience, the people that are listening, we have something called Care Action Network, which is an advocacy network. If everyone actually contacted and was involved with their representative and got others to be involved, I think that's one of the significant ways that people can make a difference. Obviously, donations are a part of the equation, and we need more and more people to give small donations, but regular donations that are a part of the lifeline for humanitarian organizations and aid organizations like CARE.
We can just go to your website.
You can. We can make it very easy for you. Yeah.
Great. We've been collecting some of questions for you tonight, and so now I'm going to bring some of those
Great.
into our conversation. And has the amount of refugees, I guess we're still talking about Syria primarily here, has the amount of refugees stabilized, or is it continually increasing? And are there efforts being made to assimilate refugees to their communities?
Mm-hmm. So it continues to grow. I think I talked about those that we don't hear as much about, which is those that are internally displaced within Syria. And one of the challenges, both from a humanitarian perspective and also from a communications and media perspective, is we don't necessarily have images of what's happening in Syria. It's not so easy to tell those stories. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and as the conflict continues it's not been tamped down, as we all know, then I think we will continue to see this humanitarian displacement and crisis. And until we find ways of ensuring that, again, Syrian refugees living in places like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon have the capacity to work and have the capacity to educate their children, I think we can continue to believe that there will be a migration crisis in places like Europe. So,
and in Europe, are there assimilation support?
Yes. So I think there are a variety of efforts that are happening. Certainly, we know that Germany has taken on a tremendous responsibility and is doing a variety of different, creating a holistic approach to how they're engaging the refugee community. And one of the challenges, I think, if you think about a place like Jordan, again, a state that itself is developing. So imagine what it would look like. So you think about the U.S. and you think about our own response to immigrants over this, for instance, political cycle. And then you think about what would it be if you were living in a community in Jordan and you had an enormous influx of refugees. And you were struggling, for instance, in the schools. You were opening schools half day in order to educate Jordanian children and then also Syrian children, and in a place like Turkey, for instance, where they speak different languages. So this is difficult, and it can be dislocating. And so one of the things that we're doing is making sure that we're supporting, for instance, communities in Jordan at the same time that we're supporting the Syrian refugees. So how do we ensure that the most vulnerable people living in Jordan are also being served and supported at the same time that we're supporting the refugee community? So I think those are some of the issues around assimilation in a broad sense, is how do we ensure that the communities have the capacity to bring people in and to create economic viability. If you think about it, the Syrian refugees are largely educated and have a capacity. Many of them skilled. I mean, the ones that I met with, a number, sitting around a circle, it was like lawyers and engineers and teachers. They have the capacity to contribute, and we need to work to support a country like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon to effectively integrate them into their economies so that it can be a net gain over the long term.
And then this next question, our audience member wanted you to look into your crystal ball, I guess. And do you see a resolution to the refugee crisis sometime in the future? I mean, is it going to take 20 years? Is it going to take 10 years? What's your
I love to ask people the crystal ball question, but I don't like to be asked the crystal ball question. It's a great question. I'd like to be hopeful, and yet I think that I have not talked to anybody that saw in the midterm or short-term horizon a cessation of the conflict in Syria as one example of an important issue. That, again, I think we have to be mindful of. It will not be solved through humanitarian effort. It will have to be solved at a political and diplomatic at the intervention level. So I think then that's also a matter of political will, and that's where we need to increase the constituency and the sense of import that I think we all bring to. We recognize that we have to try, and we have to, in a very complicated situation, yes, have to address this. So I think that that it is a quite complex issue, as we all know, in Syria. And I think one of the things we have to do is, unfortunately, think about our humanitarian response in more than 6-month increments. So as an example, as I met with a group of families in a community in Turkey where CARE was really the only kind of NGO actor and support system, and they asked if they were going to be able to continue to get food vouchers through the winter. I was visiting in September. And our CARE team had to honestly say, we don't know, because we're on 6-month grant cycles. So, we're dealing with humanitarian crises that have, on average, dozens of years of longevity, and yet we are still in a system that is sometimes working in 6-month increments. And so I think at the same time that we work for a long-term solution at a diplomatic and political level, that we need to be prepared to think about the humanitarian solutions from a longer-term perspective.
And then this next question is it more important to support Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or open our doors to refugees?
Yeah, well, I actually think we have to do both. Okay. I think that just to, if you think about it from a proportionality perspective, there are 4.6 million people that have left Syria that are refugees, and the United States has accepted about 2,600. And so we're trying to get closer to 10,000, and that's obviously with some real counter pressure against that. So that is a very small percentage of the total. But we can, there are, we talked about women and girls. We talked about the fact that they are the most vulnerable. How do we ensure that we are, that we are supporting and enabling them to be able to have some capacity for, again, rebuilding their lives. So I think we have to do that. I also think we have to recognize that our 10,000 is still a very small percentage of that total, and we have to be able to invest in those countries that are taking on a much more significant and sizable responsibility. And that means Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. And so I do think it's a both and, because I also don't think we can ask others to take on a global responsibility if we ourselves are saying we will basically have none of it.
Very good point. This next question, we've talked a lot about what CARE is doing in terms of investing in women and girls in a humanitarian crisis. Can you speak to more broadly to the work that you do investing in women and girls? And how it differs from what you're doing in this humanitarian.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that I will say is that I think in a number of places that the teams that I'm visiting are saying that we are increasingly looking at the confluence between humanitarian support, and also long-term development assistance. So in a place like Ethiopia, as an example, we are doing long-term development work, and at the same time, we're responding to a humanitarian crisis. And there is, and our teams are working on both fronts, and there's also, again, a convergence. And so, and we do believe that women and girls are a part of that continuum. If you think about the work that we're doing in, for instance, women's economic empowerment, I mentioned that I just got back from Niger, and one of CARE's most interesting, I think, and effective programs has been something called Village Savings and Loan Program. It started in Niger 25 years ago. We actually were just celebrating the 25th anniversary, and the program started with a CARE staff person from CARE Norway who came, and she was actually intending to see if she could engage women in planting trees in the Sahel. And when she talked to those women, they said, we actually need more capacity for starting and growing our own businesses, so to speak, and having more capacity in terms of economic empowerment. So they started these sort of circles of support in which women came together and they saved a little bit of money each month, and they then used that money to, for instance, one of the original women from the Village Savings and Loan Program told me her story. She started out by basically buying rice cakes and reselling them, or it was rice cakes, it was peanut cakes. And then she used the proceeds of that to buy a goat, and then she used the proceeds of that to buy cows. And she is now, they just sent me a picture of her, has a whole herd of cows that she is is responsible for, which is actually quite unusual for women in Niger. And so these original group of several dozen women have become 7 million women around the world that are part of Village Savings and Loan Programs under CARE's auspices. And everywhere I go, I've had the opportunity to meet with these women, and they have these remarkable stories of empowerment and change. And I had the chance to sit with the original group of women from 25 years ago when I was in Niger, and so fun to hear their stories, because and one of them told me, for instance, she said, my husband would not even let me leave the house. And she said, now people, when they have a new idea for the village, they go to the chief, and then they come to me. For permission, for access, incredible. And they talked about the changes that they themselves had happened in their villages as a result of their participation. They talked about building houses that were no longer mud but were cement. They talked about the fact that they had their own small businesses. Many of them had employees now. One of them who evidently had not changed at all in 25 years, the founder of the MMD, was like, "What is your secret to success?" And she said, "It's the Village Savings and Loan Program. That's why I'm not aging." And so, I think just recognizing that not only were these becoming, it was a way of giving them economic power, but it also became a way for them to support one another and to change the conditions under which they lived in their own households in terms of the level of equality and voice that they had, and within their own communities. And one of the most remarkable things about the program now, when I visit and I had a chance to meet with a group of women leaders from around the country, is that half of the women that have been elected to political office in the areas that CARE serves have come through one of CARE's Village Savings and Loan Programs. So we're kind of creating this movement of change that transcends their individual economic empowerment and is really about shifting the norms of leadership throughout the country.
That's great. Glad to know the efforts that are happening there. This next question has to do with stopping child marriage of young girls with Syrian refugee communities. I don't know how big a problem that is. And then also, I would think that with this mass movement of women and girls, we have issues of trafficking as well.
Yeah.
What are some of the efforts that you all are doing to address that?
Yeah. So CARE does have a variety of different programs, and we talked about in the humanitarian context, but also in the development context. For instance, some of our programs that have been working in Bangladesh and Nepal have been, I think, most notable for their success around working to end child marriage. And it is, there's a holistic set of interventions that are a part of this, right? Because it's a combination of cultural norms, it's a combination of education. We know that, for instance, girls that finish secondary school are much less likely to be married before the age of 18. So there's a virtuous circle around education. There are also, issues of household labor. I was in Somalia, and one of the groups of girls put on a play for me about all of the challenges that they had around education. And one of the most vivid scenes that they created was them reenacting mothers who would not let their daughters go to school because they needed help with the household chores. I mean, they needed someone to help them get the water. They needed help with, the whole set of responsibilities that the women themselves had. So changing some of, a variety of those things is all a part of that. An incredibly, I think, important set of interventions that are a part of, again, a broader set of issues. In a humanitarian sense, we do know that girls who are, you can imagine, put in these situations, for instance, are much more vulnerable to issues of child marriage. So, for instance, just from an economic perspective, families that feel like, let us marry our daughter in order to secure her future or her safety, without realizing that that's also jeopardizing her capacity for education, for schooling, for a future. And so these are, there's a whole set of programs that I think are a part of this. And just, I know we're close to needing to end, but I'll tell you a story of, because I just heard this directly from the woman whose story it was from Niger, which I think was remarkable in sense of hope and possibility, and also how a variety of different interventions that you might not expect are a part of the equation. So I mentioned the Village Savings and Loan Program. A woman that I met in Niger was actually a part of a women's leadership group that we were bringing together from around West Africa as a part of this celebration of the 25th anniversary. One of them was from Cote d'Ivoire, and she told me her personal story, which was at the age of 11, the local imam, who was over 70, asked for her to be married to him. And her family, she convinced her family not to do it. And at the age of 13, he again approached, and they forced her into this marriage. So by the age of 20, she had 5 children with a 73-year-old man who she said did not provide any support for her from an economic perspective. She talked about every single night she had one outfit, and she would wash that outfit every single night. She was responsible entirely for her children, who she could not provide education for because she herself did not have any resources. She met a CARE team member and was introduced to the Village Savings and Loan Program. She became one of the founders of the original circle of a Village Savings and Loan Program in Cote d'Ivoire. She started a salt business, and there's a whole lot of extraordinary narrative to her story, but the long and short of it is that she's become a very successful businesswoman. She was able to actually tell her husband, I do not want to be married to you anymore. She was able to divorce her husband, persuade a different imam in the village to give her sanction to do that, and she is now remarried to a man that she loves, and is not only is she providing for her own family, and has now been able to support their education, but she started 150 village savings and loan programs in Cote d'Ivoire. And so you think about the power of her realizing her own capacities, and then you think about her own children and what that's meant for the next generation, who will have the opportunity to be educated, to choose their own to choose their own partner in life. And then you think about the ripple effect of those perhaps now hundreds of additional women that have been affected through her own empowerment. And I think it's a great story of again, the integrated way in which all of these pieces come together to create change.
And I think this will be one of the last audience questions, but the investments that you make in refugees, do they follow? So for example, if there are refugees that you're supporting in the Middle East as they are resettled or move to Europe, do they still get assistance?
We don't follow them individually per se, but we do have support now. For instance, one of the great arcs of CARE story is that the recipient countries, originally in Germany and France, are now member countries of CARE, and they have their own CARE programming and are supporting and investing in efforts around the world, including CARE Germany, which is now supporting humanitarian relief in Greece and in Germany itself. And so there are individual efforts that are supporting that migration pattern as it happens. But from a continuity perspective, our programs aren't following those individual families in that way.
And this is a great question. CARE works in many communities. Is there a precursor to displacement across boundaries? Is it political instability, economic access, international intervention? What the questioner wants to know is, how do we avoid making refugees in the first place? Great question.
Yeah, what a great question. I think that there's a combination of factors, obviously, to these conflicts. But I believe that, and I think, but the thing that I would say is that I think we do have the capacity to be more preemptive and focused on taking what can be what is a small crisis and helping to ensure that it does not become a much larger crisis. So if you think about West Africa as an example now, and you think about the ripple effect of what's happening around the militants that are crossing the borders from Nigeria, how do we support Niger, for instance, in their efforts? When I met with the Prime Minister and government officials, they were literally in crisis mode about trying to secure their own borders. And what they said to us was, we need to focus on security. Can you help us ensure that we are supporting the most basic needs of our people and ensuring some of the economic growth, education, and other capacities for women's empowerment, for instance, that can ensure that our state has the resilience to withstand the efforts going forward. That whether it's conflict or whether it's, in this case, climate change, which is going to have, as we all know, a disproportionate effect on those communities that are both most fragile, most vulnerable, and that have had the least actual share of the responsibility in creating climate change. So I think we do have to think about how do we look at our crystal ball, so to speak, and think about future areas of potential conflict. One of those things that I think we have to pay attention to is, where are those areas that are going to be affected most by climate change, and how do we invest proactively, again, in the resiliency and the capacity for them to withstand future droughts, future floods, all of those things. In Ethiopia, as an example, CARE has a program in which we are working with families that are right on that borderline of fragility, that are the most vulnerable families. And we are trying to increase their incomes by several $1,000s per year in order for them to have the capacity to not be under that safety net when something happens, because there will be future droughts, there will be future challenges. And so again, I think this question of resiliency, self-sufficiency, and looking at those populations and helping support those countries that are most vulnerable and fragile.
And then this next question, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you. Here you are with the proximity to Silicon Valley. Has CARE tapped Silicon Valley for tech tools such as solar fire heater cookers and, maybe for post-traumatic stress disorder or peer-to-peer counseling apps? And then the questioner says that there's, for example, University of Santa Clara has an incubator for technology for people in need. So, are you tapping any of our resources
I think
here?
we could do more, and we actually have efforts to do more. One of the things that CARE is doing is, if you look at disaster response, there's many ways in which we're responding in pretty much the same ways as we were responding 2 or 3 decades ago. And so I think there is an opportunity for a set of humanitarian innovations that would be sort of the next generation of response. So we are creating kind of what we're calling a humanitarian lab to think about what are those next generation practices. We were actually at Facebook yesterday and talking to them about one of their products, which is called Safety Check, which is, we learned how actually complicated it is for them, but seemingly simple, in which people literally just register that they are safe after a sudden onset kind of disaster, and is also now starting to provide them with the capacity to self-organize. We know that there was a book by a woman named Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, which is about the resilience of communities to respond to natural disasters. So we assume that, for instance, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, that there's looting and that there's all sorts of mass violence, and what you really learn is if you look at it and you study this over time, is that communities actually have a profound capacity to take care of themselves, and that more so, for instance, in the Katrina example, it was people taking care of themselves. It was a failed, in many ways, a governmental effort and a profoundly effective civil society and neighbor-to-neighbor set of solutions. So I think that's all a part of how do we equip, empower, train people to be resilient and have the capacity to support their neighbors at times of crisis as a part of the long-term solution. And if people have ideas for us about how we should be engaging with the private sector, and especially the innovation and technology sector, we're hungry and excited about that conversation.
Great. And then curious, any pushback from men with the emphasis on investing in women and girls? Have you experienced that?
I think we recognize how important boys and men are to the empowerment of women and girls and to changing social norms. So it is really about whole families. And we recognize that when women and girls are lifted up, it does involve, again, families, communities, and the nation. And so we do have a variety of programs that are focused on engaging boys and men in this conversation. And one of the things that we've learned that's been interesting, we started these, they were called literally Women on the Move, was the Village Savings and Loan Program. And we quickly realized that, and I've talked to women all over the world who say, this has been so successful that my husband wants to join, or now my husband has joined, or he started his own group, or and so we completely recognize that this is a collective responsibility, and it involves people across the board, but it is about changing gender norms, which involves us all.
Right. This question from the audience is, where do you see CARE USA evolving as an organization? You've moved away from the bricks and mortar package kinds of things, and where do you see the organization going?
Well, we've just finished a strategy, so we are doing a lot of thinking about how we're evolving. And I think the biggest headline is, how do we multiply our impact, and really how do we reach the threshold of need that is that we see around the world? And I think that involves advocacy, which we've talked about. I think that involves innovation. I think that involves new partners for scale. And it involves, I think, new approaches for us to telling our story and building a movement of change. And our story meaning the collective story of I think, overcoming poverty. And so those are some of the ways that we're looking to evolve, and that means everything from, for instance, we've started we've used, speaking of Silicon Valley, the accelerator model that is used and applied in accelerating businesses for success and in readying them for investment. We're actually creating this year an accelerator for CARES programs that we think have the capacity to go to scale. So we had 73 applicants from around the world who said, we have a small program now that we think could reach 1 million people, and we want to be able to accelerate that change. So it involves, I think, a variety of different ways of operating and thinking about things differently.
You know, Michelle, it's been wonderful to have you here with us tonight. Would you like to leave our guests with any final thoughts, sort of?
I think that, first of all, this is a group of people that is already dedicated to global citizenry and being a part of the solution, and so I thank you for that. I hope that that we can continue to spread that sensibility to more and more people, to help them realize their own capacity, agency, efficacy to affect change in the world, and to be a part of both that moral imperative, but also what I think is really incumbent upon all of us, which is to be a part of a more secure and world of equality and voice in which everyone has the capacity to realize their potential. And so I would just say a big thanks, and a big thanks to you for a wonderful set of questions and a great dialogue. Yeah,
well.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all we have time for tonight, and on behalf of World Affairs, I ask you to join me in thanking Michelle Nunn for this excellent discussion, and many thanks as well to all of you in the audience for your terrific questions, and good night.
Thank you.